The royal dungeon of Dravenmore was built for confession, not comfort. Torchlight crawled along walls, slick with old damp, and on either side of the stone corridor, moon iron cages held wolves who had stopped howling months ago, their eyes following every footstep with a patience that felt sharper than rage. Guards dragged a young woman into the dungeon court, her wrists bound in silver chain, blood dried along her jaw, her clothes torn from a struggle that had clearly not gone her way. She didn't beg. She didn't look at the floor. She walked with her chin level, even as the guards forced her pace, faster than her legs wanted to go. Lord Malrek Voss stood near the throne chair set up for the hearing, his voice smooth and certain as he addressed the king. "This is the rebel girl from Grafen, your majesty, caught near the border pass with stolen goods, and Grafen blood in her veins." Alpha King Kael Draven studied her from the dais, his expression unreadable, a man who had learned long ago to trust the reports placed in front of him. "Kneel," he said, his voice carrying easily through the stone chamber, "and let the stone hear the truth your mouth refuses." The woman lifted her chin instead of lowering it. "Truth does not come because a king orders knees to bend," she said. Two guards forced her down anyway, driving her knees into the ancient floor tile set beneath the dais, and as her bound wrists scraped against the stone, a thin line of blood traced down from a torn cuff and touched the seam between two flagstones. For a moment, nothing happened at all, and Kael almost looked away, ready to move the hearing forward. Then the nearest wolf in its cage lowered its head first, slow and deliberate, as though answering a question no one had asked aloud. Then the wolf beside it did the same. Within seconds, every wolf caged in that dungeon had bowed its head toward the kneeling prisoner, not toward the throne, not toward the king seated above her. They bowed. It was not command. No voice had told them to move. No order had passed through the chamber. It looked, to anyone watching, like recognition, the kind of thing a body does before the mind has caught up to why. The sound of it was almost worse than silence would have been. Dozens of wolves moving in the same instant, chains going still, breath held. Warden Bran Oathmark, standing near the cages with keys still in hand, went very still. "Wolves in Moon Iron cannot fake obedience," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "This isn't a command working on them. Moon Iron doesn't let commands through at all. This is something else, something older than orders." Malrek's composure didn't crack, though something behind his eyes tightened. "The execution must be delayed," he said carefully, "until we know whether she has compromised the dungeon." Captain Oren Vale, standing near the guard line, spoke up before Kael could answer. "With respect, my lord, we were never going to execute a prisoner on the strength of an accusation alone. Not before tonight, and not after it either. That was never how this court was supposed to work." It was a small objection, barely noticed in the chaos of the moment, but it marked him clearly as a man who cared about process, even when it cost him convenience. Kael rose from his seat, eyes moving from the bowed wolves to the woman still kneeling on the ancient tile. "A dungeon does not bow by accident," he said. Bran moved forward and knelt beside the chains, still locking each cage shut, testing them with his own hands, finding every lock exactly where it should be. Unbroken, untouched, cold iron that had clearly not been forced or tampered with in any way. "These wolves have not been freed," he said. "They cannot pretend loyalty they do not feel. Not through Moon Iron, not to anyone." He crouched lower, brushing dust away from the floor beneath the prisoner's knees, revealing a worn carving of a wolf's head nearly polished smooth by centuries of feet. His fingers traced the shallow grooves, like he was reading something written in a language he'd forgotten he knew. "This stone doesn't belong to Dravenmore," Bran said slowly. "This is Grafen stone. It was brought into this dungeon after the Grafen Rebellion, years before either of us stood in this room." He looked up at Kael, something uneasy crossing his weathered face. "I always assumed it was quarried locally. No one ever told me otherwise, and I never asked." Kael's expression darkened as an old memory surfaced, something he had never once questioned as a boy. "My father's court called it a conquest trophy," he said quietly. a reminder to prisoners that even sacred things could be taken and repurposed. The archive label was stripped from it, years before I ever took the throne. I inherited Grayfin's rebellion as settled history. I never once ordered anyone to verify it. The prisoner's breath caught at the name, her whole body going rigid in a way that had nothing to do with the chains. Tucked inside the lining of her torn coat, a small parcel wrapped in pale moon wax pressed against her ribs, the same weight she'd carried for years, without ever daring to test it. Guards near her shifted uneasily, unsure whether to intervene, glancing toward Cale for instruction he didn't give. With the wolves still bowed and the whole chamber watching, Rhea finally did what she had never once let herself do. She dug her thumbnail into the wax and broke the seal herself. The outside had always read the same short line, one she'd memorized without ever understanding it. Open only if wolves kneel to you. Inside, in handwriting she recognized instantly, a second line waited. If the wolves bow, stop hiding. Your name is Rhea Grayfin. Your mother was the last Alpha's daughter. Rhea did not smile at the words. She felt something closer to dread settle into her chest, heavy and immediate. She had been taught, her entire life, that the name Grayfin would get her killed the moment anyone said it aloud. Now an entire dungeon had said it before she'd spoken a single word in her own defense. She thought of Mira, the healer who had raised her, a Grayfin birthing healer who had carried an infant Rhea out of the mountains the night the purge began, and never once looked back toward the smoke behind them. Mira had died 2 winters ago, quiet and unremarkable, taking most of the story with her and leaving only this letter as a last safeguard. Written for a day she must have feared would never come. She had asked about her parents once, as a child, and been redirected towards supper. She had assumed for years that the silence meant there was nothing worth telling. She understood now it had meant the opposite. The wolves were still bowed. None of them had moved. She realized distantly that she had no idea what came next, only that whatever she was, hiding from it was no longer an option available to her. An elder wolf near the back of the chamber, gray around the muzzle, was released from his muzzle strap on Bran's order, and Cale watched him carefully as the old wolf approached the bars of his cage. The wolf didn't speak at first. He hummed something low and rhythmic, a melody Rhea felt land somewhere beneath conscious memory. Older than language, older than anything she could name. She had heard fragments of it before. She realized, in half-remembered dreams she'd always assumed belonged to someone else's childhood, not hers. A woman's voice singing over her in the dark. Snow falling somewhere close, the smell of wood smoke and pine. Before she understood what she was doing, her voice joined his on the final line. Words she hadn't known she'd carried inside her. Syllables that felt like they'd been waiting years for permission to leave her mouth. The whole chamber went silent to listen. The old wolf, Elder Thorn, lowered his head fully, and something in his posture broke. Decades of guarded distance dissolving into something closer to grief and relief tangled together. We bowed, he said, because the mountain finally remembered its blood. Bran pulled a heavy ledger from a shelf near the cages, flipping through entries with growing unease. These dates, he said, showing the page to Cale. The Grayfin elders were brought into this dungeon before the rebellion charges were ever signed. Weeks before. Rhea looked at him steadily. How can a pack sign rebellion from inside your cages? Bran didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had lost all its earlier certainty. I kept the ledger, he said. I did not read what the dates were telling me. He glanced toward a locked archive door at the end of the corridor. That treaty drawer was last sealed under Minister Sereth's authority. Whatever's in there hasn't been touched since before I took this post. Cale ordered the archive opened, and while runners went to fetch it, the dungeon court fell into an uneasy quiet, guards shifting their weight. Wolves watching the door Bran had pointed toward, as though they too understood something important was about to be pulled out of the dark. A royal scribe arrived with a stack of letters bound in red cord. The documents Malrek had used to build the entire case against Grayfin. Malrek presented them with confidence. pointing to the wax seal pressed into each one. "Grafen's own seal, Your Majesty. Proof enough of their intent." But when the scribe examined the wax under lamplight, his expression shifted from routine verification to visible confusion. "This wax is wrong for the season these letters claim to be written in," he said. "Grafen used pale winter wax for anything sealed after first frost. This is dark amber, summer stock, from the Royal Office supply." He checked the ink next, comparing it against palace ledgers with the careful precision of a man who had spent his whole career learning to read paper the way sailors read weather. "This ink batch was delivered to Lord Voss's office," he said. "I have the receiving log right here, dated and signed by the delivery clerk himself." He turned the pages further, and his voice grew quieter, more certain, more troubled. "And these witness signatures, the wolves who supposedly signed as witnesses to this rebellion, 3 of them were already imprisoned in this dungeon on the dates. These letters claim they were free and signing documents in Grafen." Kale examined the seal impression himself, holding it beside an older treaty record Bran had located, studying the fine fracture line running through the wolf's fang carved into the true seal, turning both pieces slowly under the light, as if hoping the difference might disappear the longer he looked. It didn't. "Then perhaps the border was built on something unstable," Kale said quietly, almost to himself. The counterfeit seal was missing that fracture entirely. Close, but wrong in exactly the way a forgery would be wrong. The kind of small, telling flaw that only revealed itself once someone finally thought to look closely. The convoy Rhea had supposedly been caught attacking, according to Malrek's report, wasn't carrying tax grain at all. The treasury records, once pulled, showed it had been hauling moon silver, extracted from Grafen mines, and routed directly toward House Voss holdings. The treasurer read the full account aloud, unrolling ledger after ledger onto the evidence table until the numbers filled the space between them. Mining rights transferred to House Voss within a month of the rebellion decree. Timber rights sold off to allied nobles at prices well below market value. Border tolls flowing steadily into Voss, accounts for years running. Bonded service contracts placing Grafen children into indentured labor under the authority of a rebellion that had, according to every date in front of them, never actually happened before. The paperwork claimed it did. Kale's jaw tightened with every line the treasurer read, the shape of the theft becoming impossible to mistake for anything else. Malrek's mask finally slipped, just slightly. "A pack is only sovereign," he said, "until a stronger crown decides its howls are treason." Rhea met his eyes without flinching. "Then stop calling me prisoner, and answer why your minds sit on my pack's bones." The old carving beneath her knees hummed faintly. A resonance felt more than heard, but every lock along the row of cages held firm. The wolves were not free. They didn't need to be. The wolves watched her, waiting, every one of them straining against iron that still bound them, muscles coiled, eyes fixed on her as though a single word from her would be enough to end the trial in blood rather than proof, iron or no iron. Malrek pointed at her, his voice rising for the first time, the calm authority he'd carried into the room cracking under real fear. "There. She is the rebellion, standing right in front of you." Rhea raised one hand, calm despite the tension coiling through the entire chamber, despite her own pulse hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "Hold," she said. Every wolf stopped exactly where it stood, muscle and breath frozen mid-motion, obedience so absolute it made several guards flinch. She turned to face Kale directly. "If I wanted rebellion, Your Majesty, I would have howled when they bowed." Kale studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. He was beginning to understand that her power had never been about whether the wolves would obey her. It was about what she chose not to do with that obedience. He sat back down slowly, less a judge now than a man realizing he'd walked into a story that had started long before he entered the room. "Explain the rest," he said. "All of it. From the beginning, if the beginning still exists anywhere in this dungeon." Captain Oren Vale stepped forward with a proposal meant to calm the room, practical and careful in the way soldiers learn to be. Clear her of personal charges, he said. Keep her at the palace as a mediator. Review the Greyfen situation properly once winter passes. We are not equipped to void an entire annexation tonight. He wasn't wrong about the cost, and he said so plainly. The crown would lose moon silver shipments before the season turned. House Voss guards might pull out of the northern pass entirely. Border houses would demand reviews of their own old annexations, and a divided council in winter was its own kind of danger. It was a reasonable argument, delivered by a man who had never once lied to his king, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. Kael weighed the offer, and for a moment it looked almost reasonable, a path that cost less blood and less chaos than tearing an entire annexation apart in a single night. Rhea's voice cut through his consideration. A softer chain is still a chain. It may stop a war, Kael said. A cage painted with mercy, she answered, is still built for someone you have not proved guilty. She held his gaze without softening it, and around her, even the guards seemed to feel the weight settle deeper into the room. I do not ask for mercy. Mercy belongs to the guilty. I ask for the oath your crown broke. Kael looked at Oren, then at Malrek, then back at Rhea, weighing three very different versions of the same night against each other. Kael sent for the archive drawer again, more urgently this time, and it was in that stretch of tense waiting that everything nearly fell apart. The chamber had grown crowded by then. Guards and nobles and witnesses pressed close to hear the outcome, and no one noticed the House Voss guard slipping toward Elder Thorn until his blade was already drawn. The old wolf didn't cry out. He simply turned to face the threat head-on, bracing for a blow that never landed. A second man, positioned near the evidence table, under the pretense of guarding it, reached for the healer's letter, still resting, where the scribe had left it, clearly intending to feed it to the nearest torch before anyone could stop him. A third man, moving fast under the cover of the sudden chaos, wrenched the nearest cage lock open with an iron bar meant for exactly that purpose, hoping a riot would bury the evidence table under bodies before anyone could stop him. The plan worked exactly backward. The wolves surged forward as one, fast enough that no guard in the room had time to intervene. A wave of muscle and teeth aimed squarely at the men who had just revealed exactly how far they were willing to go. Rhea could have let them tear both men apart in seconds. No one in that dungeon would have stopped her, and every proof of Malrek's guilt would have died with the men who tried to destroy it, leaving her word against a lord's for the rest of the trial. For one long breath, it looked like she might let them. She raised her hand instead. Protect, she said. No killing. The wolves formed a living wall around Thorn, around Bran, around the letter still smoking faintly at one corner, pinning both attackers to the ground without tearing into them, holding with a control that made even Kael go pale watching it, a display of restraint far more unsettling than violence would have been. Rhea turned to him, steady even with her pulse still hammering. Give me oath trial, not a pardon. Kael looked at wolves who had just proven they could kill without hesitation and had chosen restraint instead. And something in his posture changed, the last of his doubt finally giving way. The dungeon court becomes oath trial, he said. Under crown law, that can be declared the moment evidence suggests the original charge itself may have been forged. Once declared, no pardon and no execution can replace a full record review. Every document, every date, every seal gets examined openly, and nothing is settled again until they have. What followed was not a simple recitation of facts. Each piece of evidence had to survive Malrek's objections before it could stand, and he fought for every inch of ground, turning pale but never once conceding without argument. Bran presented the dungeon stone inventory first, showing the date the Oathstone had been recovered and installed, weeks before the rebellion charges were ever filed. Malrek called it a clerical error, nothing more than a filing mistake made by an overworked clerk years ago, the kind of small administrative slip that happened in every busy dungeon in the kingdom. Then Bran laid the prison ledger beside it, showing Greyfen elders imprisoned before the charges existed at all, the ink on both pages catching the same torchlight, refusing to be argued into coincidence. Ria's voice was quiet but final. One date may lie. 2 dates begin to confess. The scribe walked through the forgery evidence next, methodically, refusing to be rushed despite Malrek's increasingly sharp interruptions. The seasonal wax mismatch. The ink batch traced directly to Malrek's office through the palace's own delivery logs. The witnesses who had been locked in this very dungeon on the days they supposedly signed as free wolves, standing in a Grafen assembly hall. The counterfeit seal, missing its fracture line entirely, a detail so small most eyes would have skimmed past it, except that the scribe had spent years memorizing exactly what made a seal genuine. Cale's voice, when he finally spoke, was cold in a way none of the guards in the room had heard before. You forged a rebellion with my crown's own ink. The archive runners arrived with the sealed drawer, and inside it, wrapped in protective cloth, lay a treaty written on moon vellum, untouched for years, the parchment still faintly cool to the touch when Bran lifted it free. Minister Sareth was summoned from his chambers, and he arrived already looking like a man who understood exactly what was coming. He didn't wait to be accused. I told myself a hidden truth was safer than a burned one, he said. I was wrong. It was only quieter. He admitted he'd never had the courage to destroy the treaty outright, fearing the gap it would leave in the archive. Hiding it, he had told himself for years, was the safer path. He had accepted the silence in exchange for his office and his safety, and he understood now that safety and honesty had never been the same thing. The treaty was read aloud in full, every clause weighed by a chamber that had gone completely silent. Annexation of Grafen could only be lawful following a complete council hearing, a formal alpha challenge, a moon witness present, and documented proof of blood treason. None of those conditions had ever been met. Not one. Cale read the final line himself, his voice carrying to every corner of the dungeon. Steady despite what it clearly cost him to say it aloud in front of his own court. A crown that breaks this oath rules Grafen by theft, not law. The treasurer confirmed the same transfers already laid bare earlier in the hearing. Moon silver, timber, tolls, bonded contracts, entering each one formally into the trial record this time, rather than simply speaking it aloud. Cale declared every bonded service contract signed under the forged rebellion void on the spot, though he was honest about what came next. Finding and returning the Grafen children taken under those contracts would require a tribunal process that could take months, not a single night's decree, and he said so plainly, refusing to promise more than he could actually deliver by morning. That was when Malrek finally broke, lunging for the evidence table in a desperate attempt to destroy the counterfeit seal in the healer's letter before either could be entered permanently into record. His composure gone entirely, years of careful lawful language stripped away in a single act of panic. Cale crossed the distance faster, blocking him with the flat of his own blade, not to protect the prisoner this time, but to protect the trial itself, the truth itself, sitting fragile and undeniable on the table between them. Guards seized Malrek before he could try again, and he stopped struggling almost as quickly as he'd started, the fight draining out of him the moment he understood there was nowhere left to run inside that dungeon. Cale turned to face the full chamber and spoke the words that would end everything Malrek had built. The rebellion charge against Rhea Grafen is void. A beat passed, heavy, with the weight of what came next, the whole room holding its breath together. The annexation of Grafen is void. He was careful to say what that meant in practice, refusing to let the moment become a promise he couldn't keep by morning. The annexation was suspended by his own emergency authority, effective immediately, every disputed asset frozen where it stood, with a full restoration treaty to be drafted and ratified by council, within days, not years. He continued without pause, his voice growing steadier with each line. Committing to restore Grafen territory in full, return moonsilver, timber, and border toll rights to Grafen governance under a new allied defense treaty, and seize every asset House Voss had gained through the forged rebellion for restitution. Minister Sareth, still standing where he'd made his confession, was placed under formal review that same night, his office suspended pending the outcome, the silence he had chosen for years, finally given a cost to match it. Then Kale turned to Rhea directly, and for the first time all night, his voice carried nothing but honesty, stripped of every formal edge a king usually kept close. "I forced you to kneel on the stolen floor of your own pack," he said. "I had no right. That command was unlawful the moment I gave it." She didn't answer immediately. She let the apology sit in the space between them, unhurried, exactly as long as it needed to. The cages opened after that, carefully, one at a time, not in the chaos of a riot but under careful supervision, guards and Grayfen wolves working the locks side by side for the first time in years. Grayfen prisoners held under the Forged Rebellion were released under witness protection, escorted out of the dungeon into a night air that most of them hadn't breathed freely in longer than they could count, while anyone with genuine crimes against them would face separate, individual trials, fair ones, conducted in daylight rather than torchlit corners. The bonded service lists were handed to a newly formed review tribunal with search orders issued for every child who had been taken from the pack. A process everyone understood would stretch across many months ahead, painful and slow, with no guarantee that every family would be made whole again. Bran turned over his own ledger without being asked and submitted himself to a formal dungeon inquiry, understanding that helping uncover the truth at the end did not erase what he had allowed to happen for years before it. He didn't ask for leniency. He simply handed over the keys and waited. Kale faced the costs of his decision within hours. House Voss representatives stormed out of the council chamber. 2 border houses demanded reviews of their own old annexations. The treasury reported the shortfall in moon silver that would hit before winter's end. He signed the treaty anyway. In the days that followed, the northern pass held without House Voss guards, patrolled instead by crown soldiers and Grayfen wolves working side by side for the first time in years. Border houses got their reviews too, slower and less dramatic than the night in the dungeon, but honest ones this time. The true Grayfen Alpha seal, recovered from a sealed evidence chest, was placed before Rhea at the end of the trial. She didn't accept it as a gift from a king who had finally done the right thing, and she didn't accept it as a finished title either. Elder Thorn spoke before she could, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that wasn't his alone to make. The blood is hers by right. Whether she leads us is not the crown's to decide, and it is not fully mine either. That belongs to a Grayfen assembly, held under our own stone, with every surviving elder given a voice. Rhea accepted the seal on those terms, holding it in trust, rather than wearing it as settled fact, and something in her posture eased slightly at the idea that leadership would still have to be earned in front of her own people, not simply inherited in front of someone else's court. "Restoring a stolen oath is not mercy," she said. "No," Kale agreed. "It is the first honest treaty my throne has signed with yours." There was no kiss between them, no claim made in front of the gathered court. Only 2 alphas standing on either side of a treaty neither had expected to write that morning, understanding that respect had to be built through action long before it could become anything more. Kale offered a formal escort back to Grayfen territory, guards and supplies, enough to see the wolves safely through the mountain passes before winter closed them off entirely. Rhea accepted, on the condition that any future dealings between their 2 peoples would run through the treaty they had just signed, not through royal decree alone. He agreed without hesitation, and something in the way he said it told her he meant to keep that promise longer than a single season. The oathstone itself, the carved floor tile that had held her down and then named her, was pried from the dungeon at her request and carried north with them, wrapped in cloth and set on its own cart, going home after years of being used to force other people's confessions. Rhea left the dungeon with Thorn beside her, and the Grayfen wolves following close behind. Wolves who no longer walked with her simply because her blood had once made them bow. They walked with her because she had held the power to let them kill, and had chosen not to, and in that dungeon, on that stolen floor, that choice had meant more than any bloodline ever could. Weeks later, under the mountain hall her mother had once stood in, the oath stone was set back into its rightful place, and the Grafen assembly gathered around it to hear Thorn speak her name aloud, for the first time, as something other than a rumor. Families, who had waited years for word of the bonded service lists, stood shoulder to shoulder, with elders freed from Dravenmoor's cages, reading names by torchlight, some finding relief and some finding only confirmation of what they'd already feared. The assembly's vote was not unanimous, and no one pretended it should have been after everything the pack had survived. But it was hers, earned in front of the people who had the right to grant it, and when it was done, she pressed her palm flat against the stone, the same way she had on the night it named her, feeling nothing this time but the cold, steady weight of home. They remembered her as the alpha who made every wolf bow, and then refused to let them kill. Was Rhea right to stop the wolves from killing Malrek's men, or had Grafen already suffered enough to justify letting them finish it?